and streaming live at www.newhavenindependent.org.
Welcome to Deep Focus, a radio show about movies and New Haven. I'm your host, Tom Breen, and I'm joined in the studio today by Brian Meacham, the Archive and Special Collections Manager for the Yale Film Study Center. Remember the title. And for probably the fourth, fifth, maybe sixth time, Brian is a multiple repeat guest, but we haven't had you on in a couple months.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Now that the academic year has started again and you all are in full swing at the Whitney Humanities Center, playing movies from the Yale Film Archive, it's great to have you back to talk about the latest series.
Thanks, Tom. It's good to be here.
Okay, so 2018 marks the centenary of the birth of Ingmar Bergman, the landmark Swedish filmmaker who kind of revolutionized and popularized European art house cinema in the 1950s, 1960s. Made, I think IMDb listed him as directing something like 70 films between the mid-1940s and the early 2000s. And the Yale Film Study Center has embarked upon a pretty ambitious series of showing 8 of his films, primarily from the 1950s, but a few from the early to mid-1960s as well, to celebrate the Ingmar Bergman century. So, Brian, could you tell me a bit about why you all are embarking on this series now, and give me a bit of background on it?
Sure. Well, it's it's something that we're constantly trying to do, to try to add to the collection, the film collection at the Film Study Center, by acquiring prints of important, good, useful, worthwhile films. These are films that we think are going to screen for years and years to come. They are films that really, add heft to our collection. And we have a growing collection of 35mm prints, but it's still fairly small in the grand scheme of things. And so when we have the opportunity to add films such as these, each one of these films is really, a landmark in its own right. When we have the chance to add a whole group of films like this to our collection, it's something that we really, we want to capitalize on, and we really want to spend a lot of effort doing. And that's really what we've done over the last 2 years. It's the project to acquire these films began in November of 2016, and like many acquisition opportunities, it was sort of a bit of an opportunity, of chance. It's sort of a conversation began between me and a colleague who works at the Swedish Film Institute, who mentioned that in case our archive or other archives that were members of the International Federation of Film Archives, which we have now been since 2014, would like to celebrate the centenary of Ingmar Bergman coming up in 2 years, that the Swedish Film Institute was open to striking new 35mm prints from their preservation elements of those films. Now, we don't need to digress into, the state of photochemical film production in 2016, but it's certainly a rarity to be able to get that opportunity. Obviously, film used to be the 100% of the way that these kinds of motion pictures were seen around the world. In theaters, it was all film. In the last 10 years, it's become almost all digital. And so the opportunity to still make 35 millimeter film prints in this day and age was one that we really wanted to seize upon.
Did the Yale Film Study Center Swedish Film Institute relationship, is that a unique one, or is the Swedish Film Institute kind of sending out new prints throughout the globe to celebrate?
I know of some other archives that have taken them up. I know the Academy Film Archive and the British Film Institute have taken them up on this offer, but this is the sort of thing that archives tend to do for one another if the capability and the budget and other things are there. We at the Yale Film Study Center just really haven't been at that level quite yet until now, where we are in that world, a part of the International Federation of Film Archives, and having the budgetary and gift support to be able to do a project like this. So I'm hoping that this is the first of many such projects where we are able to work with archives either within the United States or especially around the world to sort of bulk up our international cinema collection.
Now, considering how we've had you on the show before to talk about the nitty-gritty of film preservation in the context of Home Movie Day, I'm going to ask you to put on your film geek hat just for a second, maybe technical geek hat.
Or have to take it off?
Maybe just don't take it off
Yeah,
for this question. Because when you say strike new film prints from preservation elements that the Swedish Film Institute has, what does that mean? How does that kind of technically come about and then end up at the doorstep of the Yale Film Study Center?
Yeah, 10 o'clock this morning. So there was one photochemical lab left in Sweden maybe about 6 or 8 years ago, and the Swedish Film Institute, rather than see that lab go under, actually acquired it. And so now the Swedish Film Institute, like the Library of Congress, like the BFI, like a couple of other national archives, has its own film lab in-house. And so they are able to make new film prints and preserve, by making new film negatives, other material in their collection. And they are happy to do this. Obviously, the bulk of the work is done internally for their own institution, but they are also happy to do it for outside institutions. So what this means is they have, I believe, the entire Ingmar Bergman collection, and they have preserved the films of Ingmar Bergman. I'm pretty sure they've preserved all of them. That's sort of their primary. That was one of their first mandates, I'm sure. And so they have negative materials which they can use to print new prints, and those negatives are derived from, after a few generations, the original camera negatives that Ingmar Bergman shot these films on. So these are the closest you can get to the originals. We're not making new prints from the originals, but those originals are kind of quarantined. They've been preserved, and they're not going to be touched again, and it would be too dangerous to make new prints from those originals. But we're making prints that are two generations removed from the original, so they look amazing. And so that means that the Swedish Film Institute made a new film print for us, and then the subtitling odyssey began, which is the other half of the equation. Obviously, these films are all in Swedish. The original dialogue is in Swedish, and they need to be subtitled. And so subtitles exist in various forms. We would get a Word document. We would get a scanned PDF of a typewritten, just a sort of a sheet that gave a vague plot outline. You could find subtitles on various DVDs in various levels of quality, with some had a more English bent, and some had a more American English. Some were antiquated. Some left out anything possibly licentious and lascivious, and those bits had to be put back in. So that was a long process, and that took actually the bulk of the time. The making of the prints was rather painless and quick.
I'm kind of surprised to hear how many different variations there were, or maybe are, of subtitles for these films, because Ingmar Bergman, I think for a couple decades now, has been one of the most respected filmmakers in the world, and a lot of the movies that you'll be playing as part of the series have been put out by, I think, the Criterion Collection. Maybe all of them have, which tends to put together pretty definitive packages. Did you find that you couldn't just kind of watch the versions that the Criterion Collection put out and kind of copy the subtitles word for word? There needed to be some kind of updating?
We could, yes, and we did gain permission from the Criterion Collection to access a couple of their subtitle files for a couple of particular films. But subtitling, it's work that someone has done that is credited to them. That is, I think there's a bit of a gray area. It's not really a copyrighted part of the film itself, but it is its own work, which I didn't feel comfortable just swiping. I wasn't about to just sort of take these subtitles from another institution's work and just sort of throw them on our own film. So the subtitles that we used were mostly derived from material that the Swedish Film Institute sent us, and then massaged in a way so these sort of archaic turns of phrase were kind of removed and updated in some way, so audiences weren't sort of distracted and brought out of the experience by trying to figure out, oh, when they say hire, they meant rent. When you said cottage, you meant cabin. Things like that. That might not be as clear to an audience today.
And what's the lab in the U.S. or elsewhere that you use to, I guess, etch the laser subtitles onto the film?
Well, it's a two parts work. So we get the subtitles from the source, and then we send them to a wonderful man named Jerry Rudis, who works out of New York, who spots the subtitles. And if anybody attended the Art of Subtitling show that we did earlier this year, he was half of the presentation and talked about sort of behind the scenes how he lines up subtitles so they don't appear too early, they don't stay on too late, how many characters the human eye and brain can sort of absorb in a certain period of time, so the subtitles, so you're not rushing through them, or there's not more material on screen than you can comprehend. And so he lays them out down to the actual frame, how long they will sit on screen, and he and I go back and forth. I mean, we have so many emails back and forth of version 4, version 5 of all these subtitle sheets where we're sort of trying to figure out how many phrases can we get in this section, and should we cut this short, should this go onto the next screen, that sort of thing. And so once those files are all prepared, then it gets sent to Cinema Arts, which is in Pennsylvania, and it's the last lab in the United States that can laser etch subtitles onto a print. And so it's really it's a not a dying art, because I think they're getting quite a good bit of business these days because they're the only ones who can do it. But it's certainly, we felt like this was maybe one of the last opportunities we'd really have to do this kind of work. And so they line each reel up on a machine, and a laser passes over each individual frame and etches the subtitle on each frame one at a time.
And after all of that behind-the-scenes work, we in New Haven are lucky enough to be able to watch these films presented on new prints at the Whitney Humanities Center. So without further ado, let's start talking about the movies themselves. So
Sure.
there are 8 new film prints that you've struck. The first 2 screenings in the series took place earlier in September. You played Summer with Monica and Sawdust and Tinsel, 2 1953 film starred Harriet Anderson. But can you tell me about the other 6 movies in the series? And we're talking on the day that one of the screenings will be taking place. So maybe just lay out the schedule for us.
Sure. So tonight, Thursday, the 11th of October at 7 o'clock, we are beginning with The Seventh Seal, which for some people may be the only Bergman film they know, or maybe it's probably Bergman's best known, most iconic film. The scene of the knight playing chess with death on the beach is perhaps the most iconic image in Bergman's films, and maybe even in all of sort of art cinema. So The Seventh Seal at 7 o'clock, and then followed by The Magician, another film starring Max von Sydow, a very different role, a very different type of film, but made just a year later in 1958. That will be screening at 9 p.m. These screenings are once a month, so we move to November 5th, showing sort of 2 kind of deeply psychological films. Some would say possibly 2 of his darker films, but rewarding in so many ways beyond that kind of first impression. 7 o'clock will be Through a Glass Darkly, also starring Harriet Anderson, and 9 o'clock will be Persona, which is another one of Bergman's kind of iconic films, and the latest film in his filmography of these 8 films in the series. And then finally on Thursday, December 6th, we'll finish with 2 somewhat lighter, perhaps happier films for the dark winter night. 7 o'clock, Smiles of a Summer Night, and 9 o'clock, Wild Strawberries, another one of Bergman's best-known films, and made the same year as The Seventh Seal, which is screening tonight, 1957.
We'll make sure to put information about all the screenings on deepfocusradio.com, so you can find out when and where, and all of these screenings are free and open to the public, so you won't have to open up your wallet to check out all of these classic Bergman films. And I want to say that you're listening to Deep Focus on WNHH-LP, New Haven's home for community radio. I'm your host, Tom Breen, and I'm talking with Brian Meacham, the Archive and Special Collections Manager at the Yale Film Study Center, about a new Ingmar Bergman retrospective that the Film Study Center is holding to commemorate the Swedish director's 100th anniversary of his birth. Brian, you mentioned that how many 35 millimeter prints roughly does the Film Archive currently have? You said you have a growing collection, but it's not the biggest collection.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Well, I'd say out of about 6,000 items in our collection, we have probably about 900 35 millimeter prints. So.
And did you have any of these movies already? So you're just getting updated versions?
We had one 35 millimeter print of The Magician, actually, the film that's screening tonight. And it's in pretty rough shape. It has over 100 splices. And I would say it'd be an interesting comparison to show a reel of each and to see the subtitling. It's a vintage print, and I would bet that the subtitles are probably not up to snuff, certainly not as complete and as coherent as the ones that we've made. But yeah, it's really been, taking advantage of the ability to add prints that films that people know and films that have been borrowed for screenings at Yale in the past, but films that we've never really owned. And these films now will be able to screen for courses. They'll be able to screen for the public, every few years, hopefully for many years into the future. We've really thought of this kind of as an investment. We've acquired these films both through money from our own budget, but also through a generous gift from the family of the late Gene Siskel, who was Yale class of '67, who counted Bergman among one of his favorite filmmakers, and his widow and their children were generous enough to give us a gift that enabled the purchase of 4 out of the 8 of these film prints and the subtitling work on those as well. So we're really thankful to them.
So besides it being the 100th anniversary and a nice round number to celebrate someone at, why do you think it's worth revisiting these movies in 2018? We've spoken kind of broadly about Ingmar Bergman being one of the most celebrated international filmmakers in the history of the medium, but maybe let's pick a few examples of movies that are playing in this series, or just tell me a bit about what Bergman means to you. Why do you think he's someone worth watching now?
Well, it's interesting thinking about that because, I first saw Bergman films in college, 20 plus years ago, on VHS and kind of probably fairly poor transfers. And I was intrigued by them. I was really, I think, impressed by the kind of gamut that he ran from something like Smiles of a Summer Night, a kind of, 19th century romantic comedy of, a matchmaking comedy sort of thing, all the way to Persona, which, was one of the sort of more dark and disturbing films I think I saw in my 20s. And I hadn't watched many of his films in the intervening years. And then coming upon this project, especially doing the subtitle work, I've watched these films 4 and 5 times each and, stopped them, rewound them, played sections again. And I walk away. I mean, first of all, I love seeing them over and over again. I'm going to be at the screening tonight and can't wait to watch these films again, even though I've seen each of them probably 5 times in the last 3 months. But I can't help but be impressed by this sort of ability that he had to kind of encapsulate so many different things in one film. Something like Seventh Seal is, it asks the fundamental questions about, is there any meaning to life? Is there a God? Why are these horrible things happening? But then there are also there are jokes, there's humor, there's a kind of lust for life, there's a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, and they just are able to sort of encapsulate so many kind of emotions that feel really real, especially now, even 60 plus years later. These films don't feel dated at all. I mean, this film is about the Dark Ages, so it was already dated in the 50s, but still it doesn't feel as though he's kind of holding back or that this film could have been made better, kind of later on, in the history of cinema. It's really they define the term timeless, I think.
Let's spend a second more on the Seventh Seal, because I recently rewatched most of the movies in the series, and Seventh Seal was definitely the first Ingmar Bergman movie I'd seen, but probably back in high school. And to me, it represented just the impossibly adult and cultured nature of like mid-century international art house cinema. Something that was incredibly ambitious, maybe pretentious, black and white, definitely a historical timepiece set in, I think, 14th century or 15th century Sweden, as a knight is returning from the 10 years in the Crusades to find his home country ravaged by the plague. And so it's kind of daunting material to go back to. And as I was listening to one of his biographer, Peter Cowie, who's a British film historian, do, I think, his commentary track on the Criterion version of The Seventh Seal. And he's talking about how people went up to Bergman throughout his working life from the 40s through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and said, why do you return again and again to the exact same subjects, to death, to the, questioning the existence of God, to complete kind of alienation from fellow man and concern about the meaning of existence. And his response, according to Cowie, was that he would recall what the early 20th century Polish pianist Chopin would say when people said, why do you keep playing and writing nocturnes over and over and over again? Why don't you give us an opera, give us a symphony, give us something else? And Chopin said, my kingdom is a small one, but there I am king. And I think that fits remarkably well for Bergman and this incredibly ambitious, sometimes overwhelming, but really really moving, grappling with death and the meaning of life. I mean, how often do you see a movie these days that directly asks the question, what is the meaning of life and does God exist? And then actually convince you to follow along with the character through their own kind of spiritual journey. Maybe I don't know if you saw First Reformed, the Paul Schrader, Ethan Hawke movie. That, I think that is pays a lot of homage to Bergman's his big thinking in what he can accomplish through film. But yeah, there's so much humor, even right. even in the most dour subject matters. Maybe Persona, maybe the one that I think elicits the fewest laughs in its interrogation of I'm not an identity crisis for a nurse and an actress who are kind of stuck together in a coastal resort. But there's like the whole span of human emotion in Bergman films, which is a remarkable thing to behold. And I think there's such coherence across pictures that you get why, like, early 60s, French and American film critics loved him, because they could pick him apart as an auteur. And
I love, having seen these films all together, I love the sort of, the troupe of people that he works with, and just seeing these actors, in both leading roles and in small roles throughout these films, the same people coming back, and just, you see how versatile they are, and they can be, overbearing and out of touch in one film, and they can be, the warm, best friend in the next film. And I mean, just the versatility of these fine actors and actresses is
going to put you on the spot. Of the 4 or 5, so there are probably maybe 5 that I saw recurring actors and actresses in like every single one of these movies. Bibi Andersson, Harriet Anderson, Max von Sydow. Gunnar Bjornstrand
is my favorite. Yeah,
mine too.
Yeah.
So why was he someone that? And he's really in every single.
He really
movie
is.
That,
just
Bergman
seeing
made.
him in my favorite 2 performances are in The Seventh Seal, where he's his sort of the knight's kind of sidekick.
Squire.
Yeah, he's the squire who goes along with him, and they're not best friends. They talk more to other people, I think, than they really do to one another. But he has such kind of a dry kind of take on everything that's going on. And then to see him in Through a Glass Darkly, when he's the husband and father, it's just a very, very different character. And Max von Sydow is in that as well, and kind of interrogates him and puts him on the spot. And to see the way the kind of his vision of his life kind of falls apart as he is questioned about it. And I mean, it's an amazing performance, and he's just phenomenal in so many of these films.
The Seventh Seal does seem like the most striking departure for Gunnar Bjornstrand of any of the movies in this series, in that he tends to play someone who is much more polished and put together, and in either the comedies or the dramas. If you think of the Magician or Persona, Smiles of a Summer Night, even Wild Strawberries, he's someone who kind of presents on the surface level as someone who has the wealth, the good looks,
Yeah.
the steely intelligence. And he has that in The Seventh Seal as well, except this is a time period when no one looks particularly polished, right? He
Right.
is as ravaged and bitter as everyone else, but he's the kind of earthy Sancho Panza to the idealist of.
I have to say, I don't even know the first time I saw the film that even in this round of viewing, that I connected him. I almost didn't recognize him because he's very physically different, with a sort of, unshaven and kind of wearing this kind of, burlap shirt, he just looks very different from the refined, theatrical entertainer, from later on. And it's just, he's able to transform throughout so many of these roles.
And of course, it's not just Van Sydow and Bjornstrand who show up again and again, but there are a few actresses who Bergman returned to frequently at this time period, and was often in sexual relationships with, and behind the scenes. But Harriet Anderson being in those first two, Summer with Monica and Sawdust and Tinsel, and also Through Glass Darkly, and then B.B. Anderson kind of taking over as the female lead in almost all of his movies in the late 50s and mid 60s. And as two straight white guys, just to throw that, I do want to grapple a little bit with Bergman's representation of like female sexual desire in these movies, because I don't think it's something that you necessarily would expect from someone who is a male Swedish kind of renowned art house filmmaker from the 1950s. He's someone who spent a lot of time and his movies really dedicate a lot of attention to female perspective, and especially to female kind of sexual desire, persona maybe being the pinnacle of that. But I think Summer with Monica, as a kind of predecessor to some of the more like insouciant female characters in the French New Wave, I feel like there's a lot of like Jules and Jim in that character of a young kind of teenage Swedish woman who smokes a cigar, wears a beret, kind of does what she wants when she wants. Do you feel like Bergman's, like, I don't know, 60 years later, as the Me Too movement is maybe the defining or one of the defining representation fights in Hollywood right now, do you feel like Bergman's representation of women is fair, is equitable, is intelligent?
I think it was probably sort of in its own way kind of unexpected or groundbreaking, as you or at least something that you might not have assumed someone from that milieu would have done. I don't know. I'm not an academic. I don't know how well it's really aged, these portrayals, but it's certainly in the November double feature, Through a Glass Darkly and Persona, you will see some things that I don't think, that are portrayed with a kind of realism and a sensitivity to the characters that I don't know would have been given that kind of space in that period of time in the early 1960s by certainly mainstream Hollywood films, and possibly films from other places. But yeah, certainly it's something that is kind of unexpected, I think, and I don't know what the current take, what a feminist take on Bergman's films of the late 1950s would be, but it's certainly these are real characters. They're not cardboard cutouts.
Yeah, I think particularly as the movies kind of progress chronologically towards Persona, the characters become I don't know, all the more. There's a lot of just recklessness in, especially the female characters played by Harriet Anderson in the early 50s films, that is exciting to watch, but seems to be. I mean, Bergman is also kind of infamously someone who married like 5 or 6 times and had like 9 kids. I mean, he was kind of all over the place in the 1950s and 60s, and there seems to be, from again, not an expert perspective, but someone kind of ogling and trying to create this independent, exciting female character, but still told from the perspective of a very male gaze, and then getting into the 60s where Persona is so rooted in the head of these two female characters. For what it's worth, that's just my take on how things progress. And you mentioned that you rewatched these movies multiple times to prepare for the series, or besides Seventh Seal, were there any others that jumped out at you as particularly noteworthy or impactful for you this time around, or any new insights on
Well, it was something that we haven't
any of the
talked
others?
about, but I know that you and I talked about in preparation for this is the way these films look. I mean, they're all black and white in this series. Obviously, he worked for many more years and made many fantastic color films, but these are kind of the films that people think of. And with Sven Nykvist and Gunnar Fischer, that his cinematographers throughout this period, these are some of the most beautifully shot films you can imagine. I mean, they're just so gorgeous, and the way that he plays with perspective, with light, with, as you mentioned, with reflections and mirrors, especially in Sawdust and Tinsel, is just breathtaking. Just even if we didn't have the subtitles, even if you didn't speak Swedish, these are a visual feast. I mean, they're just so beautifully composed, and the black and white, cinematography just allows for so many, sort of the way he composes interiors with all these different levels and layers, and the way he composes exteriors with giant skies and a figure, a line of silhouettes of figures along the horizon on the bottom. I mean, there are countless scenes I can think of, but Sawdust and Tinsel really impressed me as one I had seen and sort of thought, okay, this is kind of melodramatic and kind of goofy, but then really seeing this beautiful print of it and seeing the layers and the way the film looked was just really amazing.
And as someone who's so fascinated with our perception of the world and the relationship between perception and how things actually exist, Bergman tends to embed these stories within stories in almost all of his films. In Sawdust and Tinsel, we spoke about that kind of this story told towards the beginning about a woman, part of a circus troupe, who kind of runs off to this rocky coastal area where she performs in front of this group of like very rowdy sailors, and then her clown husband comes and saves her. But maybe Wild Strawberries may be the best example of these dream sequences interpolated in this otherwise kind of day in the life for an accomplished medical professor on his way to receive an honorary degree, and this otherwise very kind of realistic telling of this man's life, broken up by reflections, broken up by that type of careful framing that you mentioned. All of a sudden, in these dream sequences, we have another kind of remarkably kind of visual take on what it's like to not quite feel right in your body. I think that as Victor Sjöström kind of deals with the blinding hot light and heat in that first sequence where he's walking through a desolate downtown and then sees this horse-drawn carriage come by and a coffin come pouring out.
Right.
And there's it's not just in the it's not just in the storytelling on the page that Bergman succeeds at getting us to feel that separation between life as we see it and life as it actually is, but also what Gunnar Fischer and Sven Nykvist do. It's pretty remarkable.
And those two sequences that you point out are wonderful little sort of short silent films. There's no dialogue almost, and he even sort of shot and processed them so they have this very contrasty look. They look like they were films made in, say, the 1920s as opposed to the 1950s, and they are put into these films very consciously as sort of these, almost like if your nightmare was a silent film, like it's sort of a flashback nightmare from another time, and they look kind of ageless in a weird way.
And it's all the sweeter knowing that the lead actor in Wild Strawberries is this founding director of Swedish cinema and someone that Bergman revered, and to see him kind of putting that man in the middle of a short silent film is a pretty remarkable thing to behold. Anything else about this series that you wanted to highlight? Maybe we'll go through tonight's screenings one more time just to make sure that people have the time and date and location. But yeah, I mean, Bergman, if you haven't heard of Bergman or if you haven't seen anything by him, to see his films on film on a big screen is a pretty remarkable opportunity.
Yeah, I hope people are able to take advantage of it. This is the kind of series that has been done at Film Forum and the BFI and the German Cinematheque, and of course in Sweden. Everyone has been celebrating Bergman this year, and I think it's a really great opportunity for a city like New Haven that might not have had this series come through, for us to be able to present this small selection of films. It's not by any means a complete retrospective, but it'll get you pretty far if you haven't seen Bergman before. to see these 8 films, or at least the 6 that are remaining. So we're beginning tonight at 7 o'clock with The Seventh Seal, and at 9 o'clock with The Magician. And that is a great double bill.
And where is that?
It's at the Whitney Humanities Center, 53 Wall Street in New Haven. And the screenings are free, and we're expecting a good crowd tonight. And we have an introduction from Professor Martin Haglund, who is Swedish, and we'll have the Swedish perspective on these films. So we're really excited to have him.
Well, thank you so much for putting the series together, for bringing Bergman to New Haven on this centenary, and for coming on the show to talk about it, Brian. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom.
All right, and we'll post links to all of the screenings that we spoke about today at deepfocusradio.com, where you can find over 3 years of conversations about movies in New Haven, and we'll be back next week for another show.